Again, welcome everyone to the Selective Mutism Association webinar. My name is Dr. Jamie Furr. I'm the president of the Selective Mutism Association. And I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Rachel Merson, who is a board member of our Selective Mutism Association. And she is a Psy.D and the clinical director of the Child and Adolescent Fear and Anxiety Treatment Program at Boston University's Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, or the CHILD program. Dr. Merson has extensive experience providing evidence-based treatment to children and adolescents with a range of anxiety disorders and co-occurring emotional and behavioral concerns. As director of Child Card's Selective Mutism program, she oversees Brave Bunch, Child Card's intensive group treatment program for young children with SM. In addition, Dr. Merson is actively involved in providing supervision and training to Child Card graduate students and trainees. She frequently conducts workshops with schools and community agencies on selective mutism and other topics related to child anxiety. So we welcome Dr. Rachel Merson, and she's going to be presenting on Courage at Camp, helping children with selective mutism find their voices at camp. And please, again, feel free to send your questions in the question section. Rachel.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, Jamie, for that introduction. And thank you all so much for taking the time out of what I'm sure was a busy day at a particularly hectic and chaotic time for families to be joining us tonight. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about how to best support kids with selective mutism at camp this summer, particularly because I think for many of our kids, camp might look and feel a little bit different than it normally does. Let's see, so as I get started, I wanted to first acknowledge the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation, who gave the SMA a very generous grant, which made this webinar possible tonight. So we really appreciate their support. As Jamie said earlier this evening, please feel free to ask us questions. I do want to say that I think the sort of tone of this talk will be at a little bit more of an intermediate level, sort of thinking that most of you listening have some experience working with your child with selective mutism and engaging in different types of treatment. That being said, there are kind of some topics that I might not spend a ton of time talking about and kind of gloss over. But if anyone is confused or wants more information, please feel free to ask us a question. I will do my best to answer as many questions as I can. And if we run out of time and I can't get to all of them, I am happy to respond to questions via email. So we really want to make sure that you get the information that you were looking for out of this presentation today. So summer camp. We think about being out in the woods and hiking and swimming and not necessarily sitting in front of a computer attending summer camp online. But yet, that's what some of our kids might be doing this summer. So recognizing that, I think the attendees today are from all across the country, and perhaps we might even have some international listeners. I know that what's happening in your communities might not be the same. And so I'll kind of talk about how to support kids at camp in person, taking into account some of the different restrictions that camps might have in place for things like social distancing and wearing masks and number of people who are even allowed to interact in a group. I'll also talk a little bit about how to support kids in engaging in virtual camps online from home. So with that said, Summer Camp 2020 is going to be full of some unprecedented challenges. Really, I think not just for our kids with selective mutism, but for many kids who have been out of school for several months, may have had very limited interaction with peers or with individuals outside of their kind of immediate family or kind of a small bubble. So not only are we asking our kids to engage in camp and work on brave talking goals, which is anxiety provoking in and of itself. Of course, that's why we're talking today. We're also asking them to do that at a time when they may really be a bit rusty and out of practice brave talking. They might be out of practice just engaging in the community. They might have to wear masks. They might have to stay 6 feet apart or 3 feet apart from anyone else. So it will look a bit different. Taking that into consideration, we really want to try to set the stage for success before camp even begins. Really kind of thinking about some of these factors that might make it harder before we even get to the brave talking goals. So one thing that I would really encourage you to do is make sure that your child isn't going to camp not having had or having had no exposure to kind of other community settings beforehand. I again am saying this recognizing that what may be allowed and maybe comfortable will differ dramatically depending on where you live and also just depending on your family and your kind of family situation. But I think before going to camp, it will be really important to get your kiddo used to just kind of engaging outside of the house and out in the community, whether that's at a playground or taking a walk through Target or having play dates with other kids. Again, thinking about doing that in a way that is safe and socially distant, but making sure that our kids have some basic practice just re-engaging with the world before we send them off to camp. Another step in setting the stage for success is previewing what camp will look like with our kiddos. So that might mean taking an unofficial tour of the camp facility to the extent that you're able, maybe even an official tour if that's an option, but going to the park where the camp will take place, going to the facility, walking around beforehand, doing some brave talking practice in the parking lot or on the playground so that it's not a brand new space and they are kind of going into it having had some hopefully success speaking in that physical location and have at least a modicum of familiarity with the location. In terms of previewing, you also want to think about previewing what the camp schedule will look like for your child and potentially making some changes in advance to your child's daily routine. I know that there are lots of kids who have been spending a lot of time on the couch in their pajamas, maybe getting dressed at 10 o'clock each morning or having a much more kind of laissez-faire period of time without the kind of structure of getting up and going to school every day. So if going to camp is going to really kind of be dramatically different for your child, making sure that they have a little period of time, a few days or a week to adjust to having to get up at 8 o'clock as opposed to 10 o'clock, or having to, get up at the same time at 8 o'clock, but having to eat breakfast and get dressed right away and not kind of spend the day again, hanging out in their pajamas. Because these are all kind of basic things for us as an adult, but for kids who are more anxious when they're out of practice with these things, they can just be road bumps that don't need to be there if we can kind of set the stage in advance. If your child is going to a camp in person, you may need to practice getting them used to wearing a mask. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And really importantly, just like you would communicate with your child's school before a new school year begins, we want to try to do some communication with the camp director or the counselors who will be working with your child so they know what to expect and we can ask them to kind of put in some time to best support your child in meeting their speaking goals. So letters to camp. I believe these slides will be available, or if not, the recording of this webinar will be available. And so you are kind of welcome to use this as a template, personalizing as may be most appropriate for your child. But just in a very direct and matter-of-fact way, letting the camp staff know that your child has selective mutism and that there are a few things that will be really helpful when camp staff are interacting with your child. Things like not asking too many questions at the same time, giving them enough time to respond, asking forced choice questions that have more scaffolding, not forcing them to speak, but also not making too big of a deal when they do speak. So if we can just kind of communicate some of the basic things that will kind of help our kids, that'll also hopefully set the stage for camp to happen a little bit more smoothly. So as we kind of go into summer camp, I think that one of the biggest things to do is think about revisiting your toolbox. As I said, for some of our kids, these tools may have gotten a little bit rusty as they've been spending so much time at home. And so we want to think about things like goal setting, knowing what exactly it is we're working on, not just talking, but talking to whom, in what context, and where on your child's kind of bravery ladder or list of talking goals they are and how to build from that. We want to think about rapport building and how to make your child comfortable with the people with whom they'll be working at camp, the counselors and the other kids. We want to think about the idea of stimulus fading, which is kind of a fancy technical term, which basically means kind of slowly getting a child used to speaking with a new person in a new place, using someone with whom they can already speak as a bridge, and then fading that person, typically the parent, out. We want to think about how we can instruct counselors to best prompt for speech and how to set our kids up for success by asking them effective questions. And then how do we reward them for that brave talking to reinforce it, to help them feel like they're doing a good job and to keep them motivated. So for many of you, these might be sort of familiar concepts and terms. For others, they might be a little bit newer. Like I said, I'll spend a little bit of time talking through them, but if I don't go into as much detail as would be helpful for you, please let me know that and ask for more clarification. So when we think about goal setting, the idea of setting SMART goals is really important. And many of you may be familiar with this model of making sure that what we are aiming to achieve is specific. We know exactly what we want our child to do. And really importantly, they know what we want them to do as well, that it's not kind of a mystery or a secret, but that we're on the same page, because unless they know what we want them to do, it's going to be hard for them to work to accomplish it. We want to set goals that are measurable so we know when we've achieved them and what type of progress we're making. We want to make sure the goals that we're setting are attainable, just meaning that they are not too far up the ladder and too difficult for our child, because otherwise we'll set them up for frustration and failure. And of course, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure the goals are relevant and that they kind of make sense and are important in the just overall trajectory of your child's progression with selective mutism and their work on speaking in new places. And we want to be focused on sort of the time period in which they're occurring, recognizing that these are time limited, and we may need to be thinking about specific kind of periods of time that the child will have opportunities to work on the goals, and also recognizing the fact that for kids with selective mutism, goals should be continually evolving as they make progress. So we don't want to stay stagnant at the same goal for too long. When the child has reached it, we want to then take the next step and the next step. And so this next slide is an example of that. I recognize it's a busy slide, so I apologize for all the text, but this is kind of an example of what a set of goals and a chart for monitoring progress and meeting those goals might look like for a kid going to a week or two's worth of Lego camp. And as you'll see, each day I added 1 or 2 additional goals, recognizing that what our kids are working on Friday or on the second week of camp might and probably should be different than what they're working on the very first day. And this is kind of one rubric that I like for thinking about how progress is going. Awesome, that my kiddo's meeting this goal consistently. Really great, they're making good progress, getting there, working slowly, but obviously still room for growth, and just starting for goals that are more challenging. And this can obviously be personalized. These are just examples, but certainly there can be all kinds of brave talking goals we're working on. But what's really important is to take a step back before you start and think about what is it that you want your child to do, or that they want to do, or that would be important for them to focus on during this camp experience. Here's another sample kind of sheet for keeping track of goals, where you can write out a few goals for the week, and for a camp that is going throughout the summer, update this each week. There are lots of ways to do this. No right or wrong formats per se, but this just gives you a few options. So you've set your goals, you know what your mission is and what you're trying to accomplish. So again, how do we kind of set up for success with this? Thinking about kind of rapport building and setting a relationship up with people with whom the child will be expected to speak is important. I recognize this is tricky for lots of reasons. One, because your kiddo might just be going to camp for a couple hours a day over the course of a week, and there isn't necessarily a lot of time the way that there might be at the start of the school year. Because of coronavirus related restrictions, counselors may be less flexible in giving extra time or meeting one-on-one with a camper. And sometimes camp counselors are high school students or college students, and maybe aren't the most psychologically savvy or aware of kind of child development. Not all of them for sure, and sometimes those younger younger counselors are actually the most eager and the most willing to kind of do something a little bit different and put themselves out there to work with a child. But there certainly is a kind of range of folks that you might be working with. So if possible, you want to think about identifying someone who can be a point person for your kiddo. If they're going to a camp and there are kind of 3 or 4 counselors with a group of kids, seeing if we can figure out one person who will primarily be responsible for interacting with your child. So you can spend some time doing some relationship building, and maybe eventually transfer speech to the other counselors, but really start with just one person that they can focus on. If possible, meeting with that person in advance, part of that setting the stage for success, and figuring out how there might be time for some brief one-on-one meetings between your child and that counselor. Or maybe if it can't be one-on-one, then sort of small group meetings, but a place where the counselor can give a little bit of extra attention to kind of help your child feel comfortable and begin building a relationship with him or her. We'll talk a tad bit more about that in a second. Another thing that I was thinking about as far as rapport building is, we often think about it as a relationship between a child and an adult, and helping our kids feel comfortable with the adults with whom they'll be working. But for many of our kids with SM, some of their goals are peer related, and we really want to focus on helping them speak more with peers and build relationships with other kids. And particularly because we've been so socially isolated, thinking about, is there a kid that my child knows already who is going to be at this camp as well? And can we set up something in advance? Can we do a play date? Can we have a little bit of a meeting so that there's a familiar child at camp and not just a familiar counselor? So as you're thinking about kind of this rapport building and engagement, I wrote here, remember your child-directed interaction or CDI strategies. So this might be a term that some of you are familiar with from reading that you've done or treatment that you've had with a clinician who specializes in selective mutism. But I also recognize that it might be a brand new term for some people, and you might be saying, what? So let me talk about child-directed interaction. It's a set of techniques for helping a child, particularly a child who is anxious, feel comfortable and feel kind of safe and in control in a new or stressful environment that kind of describes a way of an adult interacting with that kiddo through play, where the child gets to take the lead. The adult plays along with the child, gives them praise, describes what they're doing, and really kind of engages with them in a child-led play therapy type way. With an important emphasis on during this kind of warm up and rapport building time, we want to encourage the counselors as much as possible to not ask our children questions yet and not put speaking demands on them too soon. We just want them to feel comfortable at first. And if we start asking them a bunch of questions, we're doing the exact opposite. They're not going to feel very comfortable. So just kind of remembering these strategies that you may have been taught or may have read about at some point, or I can direct you to some readings if you would like them. So yeah, setting the stage, rapport building. And I mentioned stimulus fading, that kind of fancy term for gradually transitioning speech from someone with whom the child is comfortable speaking to a new person or a new environment. So what this might look like is your kiddo warming up, speaking with you or their nanny or their grandparent in the camp setting. And then the counselor gradually coming in and not engaging with your child yet, but being able to overhear the speech between you and your child. And after you do that for a while, and it seems like your child is at least somewhat comfortable and kind of able to keep speaking with you, having the counselor begin to slowly engage and to attend to the child's speech and their action without necessarily asking them questions yet or speaking to them directly. But by making eye contact, laughing, smiling. As a next step, that person might get a little bit closer and kind of join the activity or the interaction that you're having with your child, describing what their child's doing, acknowledging them when they speak, but still not asking questions. Not till step number 5 that we would have the new person start asking some questions that the child is answering in front of you. Maybe at first they're answering those questions to you, and then you're repeating them for the counselor. And then in kind of interim step might be while you're there having the child respond directly to the counselor. And as you kind of go through this process and the child becomes more comfortable speaking to the counselor, then you as the parent or the comfortable speaking partner can slowly fade out. So for some kids, this can happen over the course of a half hour. Kids who are further on in their treatment and have done more speaking practice. For other kids, this might take place over multiple meetings. And so the important thing is to not push it too much, but to follow where you kind of follow the lead of your kiddo. So here's an example of what this might look like at camp.
Rachel, so I just wanted to hop in. So we had a grandmother who's also a speech language pathologist ask, how can she kind of stay in that supportive role and be positive, because her granddaughter already speaks to her. So I thought that might be a good spot for you to answer that question. And also just an announcement that the handouts are attached in the side panel. If anyone needs to find those there, they can see them. Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Well, so thank you so much for your question. And I'm so glad that you're thinking about how you can best support your grandchild. So if your grandchild is speaking to you, as you said, was the case, one of the roles that you can take is almost like a coach, where you can go with your grandchild to new environments, whether it's camp or somewhere else, engage in this kind of very comfortable child-led interaction with your grandchild until, I think you said she, so I'm going to use that pronoun, but I apologize if I'm wrong, until she's comfortable speaking to you in that place. And then think about what are your goals. I actually would say think about what your goals are before even setting the whole thing up. Maybe you're doing this at a restaurant and you guys are going out to lunch together, and your goal is that she's going to order her own drink. So then you can kind of ask the waiter to come over to the table while you're talking to your granddaughter about what she's going to order, and while she tells you. And then maybe at first she tells you and then she repeats it and says it directly to the server. So you're kind of serving as this bridge for helping her feel comfortable in new places because you're someone to whom she's already really connected. Practicing speaking just with her in different environments so she's comfortable talking in different places. And then you kind of thinking about slowly pulling in other people to help her speak with them as well. So I hope that answers your question, and happy to talk about it more. So yeah, so you can do this process kind of in person at camp. Here's, again, an example of that. And I won't walk through every step, but we'll let you guys read about it. I also put together an example for what this might look like at a virtual camp, in case that is the setup that you are going to be working with this summer. So what this might look like is the parent and child warming up, playing some type of game that naturally elicits speech, where the child is getting comfortable in the room with the computer on, with the camera on, but with nobody else present yet. So it's just practicing kind of talking together in that space with that video piece that might be there, but nobody else present. So then you might set this up with a counselor in advance and have the counselor log on. So now, maybe their image is visible up in the corner, but they're, clearly not paying attention. They're, looking down, looking at something on their phone, or going through some paperwork. So they're present, but they're not engaged. And you and your child continue doing what you're doing, playing whatever game it is you're playing. Then after a few minutes of that, the next step would be for the counselor to, clearly shift their attention. So now they are focused on you and what you're doing. They might smile, they might nod, they're making eye contact, but they're still not necessarily kind of speaking or asking questions. The next step would be over the computer for your counselor to start engaging with the child. So describing what they're doing. If you guys are doing a little coloring activity, they might say, oh, I see that you're drawing some flowers now. Those are so pretty. Or, if you're playing I Spy, they might say, what a great job guessing, or that was such a good idea. It's kind of commenting on what's happening. So, there's clearly a higher level of engagement now, but still pull back from any speech demands. And then the counselor would kind of begin participating in the game in some way, whatever way is possible virtually. And that might just be by asking some questions about what the child's doing. Are you coloring a house or a castle? Those Legos are so cool. Do you think you're going to make your tower even bigger, or will it be a small tower? And have the child work on responding to the counselor's questions over the screen with the parent there. And then the goal would be for the parent to slowly fade out. And this also might be grandparent or au pair, whoever else is with the child. So the parent first might just kind of sidle to the other side of the room. So they're still present, they're still a source of support for the child, but they're not as kind of directly interacting. And then maybe the parent slips out and leaves the room, so it's just the child and the counselor. And again, this process is going to happen at a different rate for every kiddo. So if you feel like you tried this once or twice and you're nowhere near the point of being able to leave the room, that's okay. But just think about where you are, and each time you do it, try to take a little bit of a step further and think about, okay, here are some kind of big benchmarks, but there are lots of intermediate steps, like kind of where these arrows are, that we can kind of think about moving through as well. So that's the process of stimulus baiting. We also then, as we're kind of going through this process, want to think about how are we asking kids questions and how are we prompting them to speak. And so these are some strategies that some of you might be familiar with, again, depending on what you've read or if you've had any treatment for your child. And you also know what types of questions your child is most likely to respond to. There was a kid that I worked with, and no matter what type of question it was, she would never answer a "what's your favorite question?" That type of question just caused so much anxiety, having to express that preference, that was a important goal that we worked on in treatment, but a much later down the road goal. But yeah, that's the kind of question that interested adults ask kids all the time. I was at a little farm stand with my 5-year-old today, and the woman selling us vegetables started asking him, "What's your favorite vegetable? What's your favorite fruit?" So kind of thinking about, is that the type of question that your kid would be excited to try to answer and share something about themselves, or would that make them more anxious? And starting in a place where we're going to have more success. And so one of the ways where we know kids with SM can often be more successful is when we phrase questions in a forced choice format and we're giving them answer options. So it's kind of an either or. Really, there's 3 kind of main ways of asking questions. Yes, no questions, which are pretty straightforward, like, do you like pizza? Open-ended questions, what's your favorite kind of pizza? Or forced choice questions, would you rather have cheese pizza or pepperoni pizza? And forced choice questions give kids extra scaffolding because they have answer options. So when they're anxious, it makes it easier for them to recite back one of the options provided, as opposed to an open-ended question where they have to come up with their own answer. So that tends to be kind of a higher level goal. Or a yes-no question where it's really easy to respond non-verbally. There's a very small subset of kids for whom working on yes-no questions is where they are in treatment, because that's really all that they can do. But for the vast majority of our kids, we actually advise staying away from yes-no questions because they're so easy to answer with the nodding or shaking of a head. Also, we know that what helps kids get through SM is practice speaking, and they need lots of practice. And if all they're practicing saying is yes or no, that's actually really not giving them a lot of practice saying different words and giving different kinds of responses. So it's really easy to ask yes/no questions, and something that we want to try to stay away from. When we're thinking about verbal prompting, we also want to make sure that we're not bombarding kids with too many questions at a time. I think this is a classic mistake that happens, particularly with an adult who might not be so comfortable, and they might ask a bunch of questions like rapid fire. That can leave our kids feeling overwhelmed and unsure of what they're supposed to answer. So they're more likely to not answer anything. I kind of mentioned that some kids might have trouble answering questions about preferences. Others might have trouble answering more abstract questions, particularly because I imagine many of you listening have younger kids. So we want to be sure that we're not asking questions that sort of developmentally go over their head or require too complex of an answer. Super importantly, you want to wait at least 5 seconds for your child to respond. And you want to coach whoever is working with them, their counselor or a camp staff member, to wait 5 seconds too, which seems like the simplest thing in the world, but can be so hard. Right. So you guys are probably thinking, all right, that's looking at a bit of a long time that she's sitting there in silence. That was about 5 seconds. So it can be pretty awkward when you're kind of waiting on a response, and as adults, and especially adults who aren't necessarily used to working with kids with SM, we might be quick to jump in and fill that space. So kind of an important role for you out listening is to kind of preserve that space for your child so they have a chance to kind of work up to getting the question out and getting the words out of their mouth. As we're thinking about prompting, we want to also have a plan B for what do we do if they don't respond at all, and how we can re-prompt them or put in some extra support and scaffolding to help them answer the question verbally. Maybe it's giving different response options to a forced choice. Maybe it's kind of pulling them aside. So if they were in a kind of a camp setting and there were a few kids around, maybe it's asking the counselor to kind of, as much as possible with social distancing, kind of get a little bit closer to them and like lean in so that your kiddo can tell the counselor directly. But thinking about kind of how do you take a step back to try to elicit a successful verbal response. And then, of course, giving some praise when a verbal response is given. And I think it's really important that we're generally not over the top with our praise. Because often, especially in social settings like a camp, that can backfire and leave kids feeling sort of like there's a spotlight on them and they're receiving a lot of attention, which might not be what they want at all. And I've actually worked with kids who have, kind of come in with stories like, yeah, she finally answered a question at circle time in school and the whole class cheered. And then she never spoke again because that was just too much attention. But we also don't want to ignore it. So there's some gentle verbal praise, something like, that was a great answer. Thanks so much for telling me. What a cool idea. I love that you shared that with me. Can kind of go a long way in helping our kids feel like they're getting some positive feedback for talking without overwhelming them. And that's another thing to kind of share with counselors, and in this sort of stimulus feeding process for you to be doing with your child as they're practicing talking to a camp counselor.
Rachel, can you, we had a parent ask, how do you help with sort of that fade-in process with the meeting on Zoom if there's a lot of kids in a Zoom meeting kind of all at one time?
Excellent question. So I think I would maybe have a slide alluding to this, or talking about this in a few minutes, but I will skip ahead. So I think one of the things that I would really think about is asking if you can have a Zoom meeting with that counselor before camp starts. Maybe it's the day before, maybe it's the week before, maybe it's the morning of, but just seeing if the counselor is available to kind of hop on with you, 20 minutes before the whole camp gets there, because I think that it is super hard to do this if you're doing it in a whole group, and the counselor can't just give your child attention during this time, but is trying to kind of run an activity. If this is a camp, an online camp that has kind of multiple adults involved, one option might be, again, identifying that point person that I referenced earlier, and thinking about, even as like the camp begins, and one counselor is probably taking the lead in going through the first activity, can the point person counselor kind of jump off into a breakout room with your child for a brief period of time and do some of the fading in that way? So, good question. And then the last of those tools in the toolbox is rewarding brave talking. So many of you have probably had different types of reward systems for acknowledging brave talking practice and helping kids reach their brave talking goals. So I don't want to spend too much time kind of going into the nitty gritty of this, because I also could probably spend like 45 minutes just talking about setting up an effective reward plan. So this is more of a reminder that you should still be using reinforcement, and that it's a really powerful tool, especially for kids with selective mutism who are, obviously not universally, but often in that kind of preschool to early elementary school range when reinforcement can be a really powerful motivator. So you want to think about making sure that there is something set up, that your child has invested in this plan and that they're working towards something that they care about. That's one of the biggest mistakes that parents set up a reinforcement system and the kid doesn't really care about what they're getting, so it's not going to work very well. It also should be something that is maintainable. We're not kind of talking about these like big rewards. No one needs an iPad or a trip to the amusement park for working on brave talking, but things that kind of can be delivered with a good amount of frequency and that are smaller but still meaningful. Also, I love social rewards, doing something special with the family, having an ice cream sundae party for dinner, having a special family outing. So different kinds of things to think about. So some coronavirus considerations. If your child's going to camp and has to wear a mask, this is definitely something that you want to prepare them for, especially if they haven't been spending a lot of time out of the house and aren't used to wearing a mask. So wearing it around the house at home just to get used to the way it feels, perhaps wearing it for increasingly longer periods each day, so they get used to kind of having it on not just for 5 minutes, but for an hour. Having your kid do different activities while they're wearing the mask. It's one thing to sit there and do an art project with it on, but it might feel a little bit harder to play a game of red light, green light with the mask on. So kind of having them both be kind of engaged in quieter, calmer activities and more active activities. If you have a child who is feeling really uncomfortable about a mask, some things that you might think about doing are incorporating the mask into your playtime, especially if your child's a little bit younger. So maybe they're making masks for their Barbie dolls or their stuffed animals or their superheroes. Maybe you're using the masks as like a slingshot to fling cotton balls or M&Ms across the room. Just things that make the mask feel more playful and less scary. Along those lines, you can have your child personalize the mask, and that might mean kind of purchasing a mask with fabric that has Anna and Elsa on it, or fabric that has Spider-Man on it. It also might mean letting your child decorate the mask and really kind of make it their own, write their name on it, put rhinestones and glitter on it. But let them kind of take some ownership of it and have some fun with it. So these are kind of a few steps towards making wearing the mask a little bit more comfortable. Another challenge of wearing masks is that it can make it harder to hear. And for our kids with selective mutism who aren't known for having great volume to start with, that is definitely an extra complication. So one of the things that you might want to practice at home with the mask is being loud. And of course, being loud at home for a kid with SM is very different than being loud in a social situation. But getting used to talking with the mask and trying to increase their volume with the mask on can be a helpful first step. Another thing that is kind of not ideal for kids who aren't great at speaking loudly is having to speak from 6 feet apart, having a hula hoop around them as they're going throughout their camp day. So, again, I think a lot of this has to do with just preparation in advance, kind of doing some like silly games and activities at home where, everyone has to run around the backyard but stay 6 feet apart. And, maybe you have hula hoops or ropes or boxes drawn, in sidewalk chalk on the driveway of, kind of where everyone kind of has to be, and just getting kids used to that kind of physical distancing that they may be experiencing. I know that where I am in Massachusetts, summer camps are opening, but with some pretty strict limits on group size. And for our kids with SM, I feel like that actually might be a positive thing because larger groups can be more overwhelming. There also are restrictions around different groups not intermingling. So kids are kind of staying with the same smaller set of kids and counselors each day. So I feel like that, but has the potential to be a little bit of a silver lining in this messy situation and help kids become more comfortable more quickly with kind of a core group of people with whom they'll be interacting. And having to be 6 feet apart, as hard as it is to speak loudly, can be a good way to work on volume. And it might be the kind of situation where everyone's going to be coached to speak a little bit more loudly. So your child may not be standing out in the same way as they normally would, because, if every kid has a mask and has to be further apart, it's not going to be easy for many of them. And lastly, virtual camp and engaging online. So since most of our kids had some form of online schooling this year, I think an important first step is to really kind of reflect on what the spring was like and how it went and what worked and what didn't work, and try as best as possible to kind of learn from those experiences and kind of either provide feedback to camp staff about things that like your child's teacher did that really helped them engage, or things that were disasters. Also for you, thinking about how are you going to keep your kiddo in front of a computer screen? How are you going to make sure that they turn the camera on if those were things that were hard? So you might want to think about practicing doing more online kind of Zoom meetings with family or with friends before camp starts, if it was just really hard to even be on the screen, period. To kind of get more used to talking to people over a computer. Going back to the slide a few minutes ago about rewards, you might want to think about kind of your baseline reward is earned for staying in front of the screen and looking at the screen and engaging in the activity that's going on at camp. Those also might be some of the goals. You might start with goals that are more behavioral and not speech related. I think that if you're online, there actually potentially is more opportunity for one-on-one time with a counselor. Because I think that when you're kind of dropping your kid off at camp or picking your kid up at camp, and all the other parents are there at the same time, dropping their kids off, and there's a lot of like activity and transition, it can sometimes be harder to pull a counselor away to meet one-on-one. But if that counselor is at their home and they're sitting at their computer waiting for camp to start and don't have anyone else that they need to deal with at that time, it may actually be a little bit easier to kind of get them to have that one-on-one time with your kiddo. It also might mean that there are times that they potentially could log on for a one-on-one session outside of regular camp hours. If you're meeting for camp in person and your camp is from like 9 to noon every day, it's going to be probably pretty hard, if not impossible, to ask your counselor like, oh, well, can you meet with my kiddo for this one-on-one session at 3 o'clock? But if you're online and everyone's kind of home anyway, there's much more flexibility in terms of just not having to go somewhere and not having to kind of be at a particular spot. So again, maybe another silver lining. I would encourage you to think about using the chat feature of programs like Zoom strategically. So I have kids with SM that I'm treating. For some of them, using the chat is actually a goal because they're kind of not able to speak in these group settings at all. And this is a step towards that. And so it's something that I've been encouraging and we've been working on, and it's pretty anxiety provoking for them even to ask a question or respond via chat. However, for other kids, it becomes a crutch, and if they keep asking questions over the chat, it means that they can kind of participate and get their needs met and not have to use their words. So you want to think about, where is it offering like a step stool up, and where is it actually holding you back, and making sure that you're not relying on it too much while also being open to it for extra scaffolding. Another potential benefit of online camp is that you as parents and caretakers can be there. At a day camp, you're obviously dropping your kiddo off and heading out. Maybe you can stay for the first half hour or so. But for an online camp, like if need be, you can sit with your kiddo as they're engaging and serve as that live coach. When the counselor asks a question, you can help prompt your child to answer it. When everyone is supposed to go around and share one thing that they're looking forward to about camp, like you can have a little sidebar conversation with your kiddo, help them come up with an idea, and you kind of help scaffold their response. So there actually are ways that as a parent, you can provide more support and coaching in an online camp format than if you weren't there at all. The responsibility would really be much more on the counselor and on your child to do some of this independently. All right, so it's a lot of information shoved into a short period of time. Thank you guys for listening. My contact email is down here, so as I said, you can feel free to reach out. And in our last few minutes, Jamie, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Sure, yeah, great person. Thank you, Rachel. So another person asked, how does family balance brave talking time with everyday? So sort of that balance.
Yeah, such a good question. On one hand, we can talk about the more practice, the better. On the other hand, we all need downtime, and we don't want our child's whole life to be about practicing brave talking without any time for them to be able to just relax and have fun and be a kid. So I think that one thing to think about when you're practicing brave talking is kind of just balancing those two kind of competing things that are important. You do want to think about practicing regularly though. And by regularly, I mean, multiple times a week, as many days as possible a week, even if it's just once a day. Practicing once or twice a week is, if that's all you can do, well, obviously that's better than nothing, and that's great. But it might not be quite enough to keep the momentum going. And the other thing I think you want to think about is that sometimes doing these practices requires time and patience on your part. And if you're going to go practice at a restaurant and you're really going to sit there and support your child until they're ready to answer, like you need to have the time and patience and bandwidth as a parent to be able to do that as well. So I often say to parents, don't set up a practice unless you're able to kind of, go all in and see it to its end. And that might mean, doing it when you don't have, your child's two younger siblings in tow and they're going to be tantruming and needing attention. Or don't do it when you are running late to, get to your, get to a birthday party or whatever it might be.
Great, thank you. And this is a little bit of a separate topic, but maybe you can comment, and I'm going to send this person some separate resources. But clearly we've spent more time talking about working with kids with selective mutism. Any brief comments you can make on working with adults with selective mutism?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're working with an adult with selective mutism, I think that really engaging that person in the process is, super important, and that they need to have some agency and some kind of buy-in and motivation and control, so that, they are kind of an equal and active participant in the process. There may be still ways to think about reinforcers, but you would obviously be thinking about that a lot differently than a star chart. But maybe there are things that this adult has really been kind of wanting to do and can reward themselves, or a family member can kind of reward them for doing different practices. I would also really think about, for the adult, what is going to be most functional for them and most consistent with their values. You know, if they are someone who wants to kind of have a job and be employed, what type of speech is going to help them get to that place? You know, if they're someone who wants to be involved in kind of more social relationships, what steps are going to help them get to that goal? So really, you know, kind of tapping into the things that kind of are functional and that they care about, even if when they think about their lives.
Great. Well, we are out of time right now. So thank you, Rachel, for the great presentation. Just a couple of things to note in the chat box. You can find the recording of the webinar on our Selective Mutism Association's YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And if you go to the SMA's channel, the link's provided in the chat. And if you go there, please subscribe. This is exciting. This is pretty new. And we will also email you a link, the handouts, and again, as well as the presentation will also be on our Facebook page tomorrow and our website. So you can find it on any of our different platforms. So thank you all for your time, and you can reach Rachel at her email address there.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure to be able to speak with you.